with learning Mishnayot. We had done Ot Aleph before. I don't have handouts this time because the Mishnah that we're going to learn is a Mishnah that everyone probably knows, at least on some level, which is Bet B'Mem Elikim. Right? We say it every Friday night. Does everyone say it? Right? Everyone says B'Mem. Well, are you in communities that say it? Whether or not you say it is a different story. But we say it usually in between Kabbalat Shabbat and Marv. Right? What are the candles that? Oh, thank you. All right, let's see. There we go. This may or may not work. Someone had asked me to put it on there. The last time I did it, my phone died in the middle, so it didn't go also. So I guess if you get 3 times it doesn't work, then that's the chazaka not to do it. So there's 2 questions that I wanted to ask about this mission. The first one is why the specific wicks, or the specific wicks and the specific oils that are mentioned, why are those ones that we are permitted to light with, and why are the things we are not permitted to light with? And the second question is sort of a meta question, like why do we say this particular Mishnah at this particular time each week? So the truth is the first relates to the second, and the Mishnah seems to at least say that it's a very practical reason why the certain wicks are permitted and some wicks are not permitted, and the oils are permitted and which oils are not. And it has to do whether or not they burn well, right? There are certain wicks, that just, no matter how much oil you put into it, they just don't absorb very well, and therefore they're not going to light very well. In fact, there's a story the Gemara tells about one of the wicks that is prohibited. Basically, it dries up so fast that it causes a fire. And the story is told about there was a mother-in-law. If you ever want to see it inside, I think it's on Kaf Vav in Shabbos. The mother-in-law did not like her daughter-in-law, and so she told her to go and sort of anoint herself with a certain type of oil, right, on her body. And then afterwards, the daughter-in-law comes back to the mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law says, now go light the candle. And because she was already sort of oiled up, and the candle was the wrong type of wick, the fire broke out, and she got caught on fire, and presumably the mother-in-law got what she wanted. And we learned from that there's a practical reason. There's also halachic practical difference, not just that we don't want to burn ourselves, but the concern is that if it doesn't burn well, whether it's because the oil doesn't burn well or the wick doesn't absorb the oil well, that you're going to play with it. You're going to tip it over in order to get it to burn well, and you're not permitted to do that in Shabbat. So this is a very practical explanation of why we are supposed to go forward in this direction. The Aruch HaShulchan says, today, our candles, or in his day, our candles don't have any of these problems. We have, good wax candles that light and everything like that. So it's not really very practical. We don't really need to recite this to remind us what we can do and what we can't do, what candles work and don't work. And so perhaps that's why other customs have developed Friday night to come up with, like, for example, Kagavna. It's actually a much more recent addition than B'Mem Elikim. And the reason why is that it didn't have practical effect anymore. We didn't need to know which ones work, which ones don't, because we all have the exact same type of candles, at least they have the same type of candles, and so therefore you don't need to know anything specific in that regard. So if we say that it's a practical reason, as I said, that may then also affect the second question is, why do we actually say this on Shabbat? So the Sephardic custom, as you mentioned, is to say it while it's still Erev Shabbat. And the practical reason is, if you start saying this in the continuation, not just in the first Mishnah, but the continuation, we're asking 3 questions, right? We were supposed to remind ourselves. Did we light? Did we make an Eruv? Right? Did we do Maser? Did we tithe? And so therefore, if you didn't do any of those things before Shabbat, you now recite it, you can run home and quickly fix it and correct it and go into Shabbat properly. So that's a Sephardic custom, and it makes a lot of sense. But here's the problem. The Ashkenazic custom is not what we do today. The original Ashkenazic custom, it seems to me, the Beit Yosef says, by interpreting in on what the Torah writes, because he writes this explanation of so you have time to explain it, he writes this with regards to Kiddush at Shul, which is already at the end of Marv. So the Beit Yosef says the Ashkenazic custom, and it seems to be the case, is that they would say at the very end of Marv. And I never been in a shul that actually does it at the end of Mariv, but I did come across there is a society here in Israel called the Sidlish. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that town in Poland. It's about, from what I could look up, about 60 miles east of Warsaw, in the Lublin district. And there's a number of Jews who've moved from there to Israel, and they have an entire archive dedicated to their customs. And I came across sort of one of the things written by someone who was very young at the time, and now he lives in Israel, and he wrote about the experience of growing up in the great synagogue in this Polish town. And he says, he writes as follows: usually in most communities, the evening prayer ends, right, during the week, as well as in other communities, with Aleinu. He says, but not so in the great synagogue. Here comes at the end of Mariv, right, instead of Aleinu, or after Aleinu, B'mamad Likim. They say that at the very end of Mariv, which was a vitally supplement after Arvi. It's difficult to describe in words the prayer of Cantor Zobelitz. Every word uttered rolled like a shining pearl. It should be noted that in this prayer, the choir did not participate at all. Nevertheless, the cantor created a sensation of hundreds of voices participating with him. And why am I saying that? When you look at this prayer, you find the words, "He extinguishes the candle." You also said, these words were said in half chanting and overemphasis. The climax was when he began to say the 3 reasons for dying at the time of giving birth, right, which we say later on in the chapter. And the 3 things that one has to say. Could anyone imagine a force which could stop the huge crowd from joining the great cantor singing? Would anyone have thought of telling each other to deviate from this custom? There was a mighty chorus led by nobody. It broke out from hundreds and perhaps thousands of throats of those present, those standing in the gates of the synagogue. That there was this elaborate, beautiful, it's hard for us to imagine. Like we rush through it and it doesn't actually, but the image I get it's almost like an Tana Tokef. Right? When you say the 3 things you might die, it's almost like this emotional, very powerful experience. It's hard for me to relate 100% to what he's describing, but this was at the end of Mariv. And the question then becomes, if the purpose why we do this is to remind ourselves that we might have violated, we haven't yet tithed, or we haven't yet, done what we get the candles properly. So why would it then take place at the end of Mariv? It's already too late. There's nothing you can do about it. What's the source of the Ashkenazi custom to do it at the very end? So there's a couple of possibilities, explanations that are offered. One of them, the Vilna Gaon, by the way, says it doesn't make sense at all to say it at the very end. And he, therefore, doesn't understand the Ashkenazi custom at all. And as I said, some people, therefore, have changed it. Right? They've either done Kigav. I remember reading that Rabbi Riskin, when he started his shul, he did away with it, remember, in New York, and they would just learn about Hilchot Shabbat, that he thought that was a much more practical, effective way for people to welcome in Shabbat, and he would spend that time doing that rather than reciting this in sort of a rote manner. The Bach explains as follows. He says, this was primarily for the summertime. Summertime, they would bring in Shabbat early. So they would bring in Shabbat early, Plaga Mincha, after Plaga Mincha, and so therefore you had a time in between before you could recite Kiddush. So they would learn Torah. And this is the part of Torah that they would learn, not because they could then do something about it, but when they would then go home and it's, let's say, still light out, they might be tempted, if they hadn't tithed, or if they hadn't set up the candles properly, they might have been tempted to fix it. But the point was, they would read this to remind themselves they're not allowed to do this, even though it appears that Shabbat is not yet come in, to remind them that they're not able to do that. Another reason they found in the Cairo Geniza, there actually was a bracha in some places that they would make a bracha before saying the Mamalikim. We don't have that. Actually, the title of the article, someone wrote about this piece that they found in the Geniza, is entitled An Unknown Blessing on the Reading of the Chapter B'Med Madlikim from the Geniza. So there's a bracha, apparently. No one really knows what it was, but it was like the community stood up and they did it together, a loud bracha. It was something very significant and important when they would recite this statement. And maybe this is the source of why it became this beautiful song in this community in Poland. And the explanation was, because there's a machloket between the Jews, right, rabbinic Jews, and the Karaites about lighting a fire on Shabbat, right? The Torah says in Shemot that you can't light a fire. We understand that you can benefit from fire if it's lit before Shabbat. Karaites say, no, you can't have fire at all on Shabbat. So we would read this thing from Hakim to make the statement that we interpret the Torah in accordance with rabbinic Judaism, not according to the Karaite and just Torah Shebechtav. So perhaps that's the reason why. Even you can have a value saying it at the end of Mariv, because it wasn't about learning anything particular, but rather making a sort of an important political statement. There's one more reason that I want to mention, and let me just give it a little bit of context and go back to the question of why do we light candles at all? And there's a couple of different opinions. Rashi says that we light candles because there is an obligation to light candles, because there's an obligation to see the food that you're eating. That's what makes a meal chashuv, is that you can see what you're eating. And the custom was, during the week, lighting candles was expensive. Oils were expensive. And so the typical day, as soon as it became dark, people didn't light up their houses. They went to bed. Come Shabbat, they would light the candles to make Shabbat is special. So they'd stay up, they'd have a festive meal, they would learn Torah, whatever it was, but Shabbat became unique because of the lighting of the candles, that they were able to extend their day. So he says that it was for Kavod HaShabbat that they would light the candles. And so that you could have the meal. Others, however, and Mishnah Berurah brings it down as a halacha, the reason is that you have to light the Shabbat candles is, I imagine one reason that more of us are familiar with, is mishum shalom bayit, right? That you should not, right? It's late at night. Shelo yikashel be'etz or be'evan. You shouldn't be walking around the house and it's in darkness and you step on a stone or you step on a rock. You hurt yourself, you scream, you get into a fight, husband and wife fight, and there's no shalom bayit, there's no peace in the house, but light provides an opportunity to increase the amount of peace in the house. I want to suggest that perhaps that last idea of peace in the house was extended to the peace in the community, and that's why we have this B'madlin Kim that could be said at the end of Mariv. So the Magen Avraham says the reason why it was said at the very end is because if someone came late to shul, they would extend davening a little bit, and maybe that's why they even extended it with like this beautiful chorus in the song. They would extend davening enough for this person to catch up with the davening, so they could all walk home together late at night, and that they could sort of be safe in their returning to their respective homes after going out of their homes to come to the shul. So there's an element, I think, of sort of creating a sense of peace in the community and comfort. Even the latecomer will be protected by adding this extra. The thing I just want to end with is, of course, the question of how did we get to where we are today, where our custom is we say it neither here nor there, right? We don't say it at the end of Mariv, and we also don't say it really, we say it at the end of Kabbalat Shabbat. It's already too late to get home to do anything about it. This question came up actually during COVID. There was a Rabbi Cohen who wrote an article in the one of the halachic journals about should you say, if you're davening all by yourself, v'mamadlikin, because if it's for the reason of so everyone can walk home in peace, it doesn't make any sense. If it's for the reason to remind you, right? So then it does make sense still. So how do we explain our particular custom? So his suggestion is maybe what took place is as follows. It starts off as a way to extend davening so everyone can catch up. But that extending davening so everyone can catch up is not ideal, because what happens? A person comes late to shul, and if they've missed Shema, normally you're supposed to say Shema and then Shemona Esrei, right? We're supposed to connect Geula to Geula, right? But if a person comes late, and the halacha is that if you're already at the Amidah, you just jump in and join with the Amidah and then say the Shema afterwards. And you miss out, therefore, on the theme of connecting Shema first to the Amidah, but at least you recited with everyone the Amidah. So he suggests that perhaps at some point in time, the custom of saying at the end of Mariv migrated to saying it a little bit earlier, and that way what would happen is the person who comes late, so while everyone else is saying B'mamlikim, he was able to catch up with the davening, so he could start everyone start with everyone when they say Baruch Hu and Shema and the Amida. So not only he catches up with everyone, but he's able to actually start and finish with the same unit of starting with Shema and Amida, Gula to Geula. Okay.